Hello, everyone. Today, Dr. Shefali Jha will talk on digital ethnography in migration research. She has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. Areas of interest include political anthropology, cultural studies, feminist theory, and practice. She is currently with the Dhirubhai Ambani Institute of Information and Communication Technology in Gandhinagar, Gujarat. She has earlier taught at the Department of Comparative Literature and the Center for Women's Studies at University of Hyderabad. Dr. Jha is also a member of Anneshi Research Center for Women's Studies, Hyderabad. She is now working on her book, Manuscript on Minority Politics in Hyderabad. So we hope it will be a very interesting talk. So over to you, Shefali.
Hi, everyone. First, let me thank the good people at CRG for inviting me to be part of this workshop. Very happy to be here to kind of contribute to this conversation on studying migration. So as I said, I'm happy to be part of this conversation. And I mean the conversation part because I'm not here as an expert on either the digital or, migration studies. But mostly, as an anthropologist who's interested in thinking generally about new methods and fields that challenge us to think differently about, about ways of life, about culture and location. So let me just at the start give you a map of how this talk is going to go. I expect to speak maybe for about 40 minutes or slightly more. And I want to present to you, as I start, I'll start with a broad picture of what we mean when we speak of ethnography, first and foremost, right? That will be a brief kind of discussion. And then in more detail, we'll go into what digital ethnography and digital anthropology are. We'll discuss some examples of both. And in the concluding half of my talk, we will talk about some of these examples, which all have to do with trying to understand migration as a kind of multifaceted social phenomenon, right? And the kind of questions that it throws up for anthropologists in general and digital ethnography, in particular. So I hope very much that you've all been able to read the blog entries that I assigned for this session. And more importantly, that you tried to play the video game that was part of the exercise, because it's, we're going to be talking about that. So as you know, if you did it, you know that the video game was designed by the author of the blog and his team. So we'll talk about that. That's my last example in this presentation. As one of the more innovative kind of interventions, right, that digital ethnography makes possible. And you already, you're halfway through this course, so you know the drill about questions and comments. So I'm, we'll be discussing those. Okay, so let me start by talking about ethnography, right? As the slide shows you, and many of you will already know this, and if you don't, you can Google it. It will tell you, right, that the term ethnography is a combination of ethnos and graphine, right? The Greek words, which is literally writing about a group of people or a community. Right? I will not be discussing the theoretical issues or political issues that come up with this translation. But I will point out that another way of translating it is writing culture, right? And in the background to this slide, you can see the slightly blurry, intentionally blurry cover of the very famous volume called Writing Culture, which was published in 1986. That took up some of the issues of, what ethnography means. So as many of you will know, for many, many anthropologists, ethnography is the kind of thing that defines the method that defines the discipline of anthropology, right? But it's also true that it's not, possible today to be a social science, a student of the social sciences or practice social science in some form, whether you teach it or you belong to a social science discipline, without knowing what ethnography is. So in that sense, it's become a kind of ubiquitous method, right? And what we mean when we talk about ethnography, roughly, right, is you spend a considerable length of time, and that's crucial, right? That it can't just be a few weeks, it has to be a considerable length of time within a cultural world that may or may not be different from your own, right? And you try to become familiar with the concepts and practices that make up that world, and the way that people make connections, or the way that those concepts or those practices connect up with other practices that you may be more familiar with or you may know about from other places. Those connections, continuities, differences with other people, places, and practices. So there is a certain kind of comparison dimension always to ethnography, right? And then, of course, there's the next step, which is, once you've um, done your field work or whatever, you've lived in this place with these people, you have to write about what you learned, how you learned it, what might its significance be, both for the people that one, lived and worked with, and for people that one writes for, right? And as we know, for a long time, these were completely separate publics, right? The people that one worked with were likely never to be able to read what one had written about them. And so it was an added kind of the anthropologist's job to mediate between these two very different kind of publics, audiences, groups of people, communities, right? So when you think of anthropology, right, there are these dominant images of what it means, right? And I've listed here a few of the things that lay people or interested non-academics, many academics even in other disciplines, generally think, what anthropology is about, what it involves, right? So it's the study of tribes, it's isolated societies. Both of those sometimes mean the same thing to many people, right? It's basically studying rituals, right? Observing people and making little notes about what they're doing when some rite is going on or whatever, and writing about it in detail. Or, and this is very common in our, especially the global South, Africa and South Asian context, that, it's for upliftment and development of these backward populations. Once you've gathered knowledge, you can make policy with it, right? The images on this slide, maybe some of you will recognize, right? On the right is the image of Bronislaw Malinowski, who is kind of the pioneer of the fieldwork method in ethnography. That was taken just after the First World War, when he was doing his study of the Trobriand islanders, right? That photograph is from the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, which is one of the first maybe fieldwork-based ethnographic monograph, right? So those of you who read the essay that I assigned for this class will remember that Pia, who's the author of that blog entry, he rewrites the famous opening lines of this book, right, to describe his own project. And that tells you that it has this iconic status in the discipline still, right? So here is, you can see Malinowski sitting with the natives of the Trobriand Islands. You can see, immediately the stark kind of racial and colonial difference, right? That enables this kind of work, the way the bodies are positioned, right? And it's also, when you take a photo like this, it's evidence of authenticity, right? Like, he was there, he talked to these people, he lived among them, he's sitting there, looking comfortable, and it's this documentary kind of photograph. Everything he says about them is derived from this long experience of being there, right? And this is a kind of classical image of what it means to do ethnography as an anthropologist, right? On the left is an image from another kind of iconic ethnographic work, very different from Malinowski's, and done 60 years later. It's from, those of you who are not familiar with this book, I highly recommend it. You should all read it. It's from Leila Abulhoud's study of Bedouin women's poetry, and it's called Veiled Sentiments, right? Now, in this image, you can see the difference, right, from the first one, from the one on the right, right? The anthropologist is absent. She is kind of, looking at, she's in the look of the camera. The entire photograph is dominated, right, by this really striking woman who is not looking back at you, right, at the person who's looking at her. It's really like, she doesn't care what you think, or she's in her own, she has this look which is very determined and kind of quiet, and she's thinking, her own thoughts. And we're not really kind of invited into the picture to share them, right? But the clothes, the jewelry, even, if you look at the image, the background will tell you that, she's from a specific place at a specific time. It is the ethnographer's job to kind of place her, right there. So if you look at these two images together on the slide, you see that there is a contrast, but there is also a continuity, right? So there is a questioning of the kind of tradition that comes down from Malinowski, but there is also a certain kind of, the idea that you show through these photos that you were there, and that you lived with the people that you claim to be knowing about and writing about, right? So there's a whole tradition or in these 60 years, which we will come to see some of those questions carry over into digital ethnography, right? When we come to the next section. So the key word I want to take from this part of the talk is mediation, right? As I said earlier, it's the anthropologist's job to mediate between different publics, right? The people that you work with and the people who will read about the people that you work with, right? And so that, for a lot of people, for academics and for other people, the value of ethnography lies in this kind of firsthand knowledge, right? Which we don't think of as mediated. People say, okay, from these photographs, I know you were there, it's authentic, it's real, right? It's unmediated truth, right? I believe you, the stories you're telling and the account you have of these people who I may not ever visit or know anything about outside of your book, right? And you know this as an anthropologist because you were there. You heard it from the horse's mouth. Your job is basically to relay it to other people who will never go there. Right. Now, of course, anyone who has ever actually done or even studied ethnography knows that, this is kind of a fable. But I won't get into the debates about that too much. But basically, I want to here say why I've gone so much into the kind of the ethnographic method is because the digital domain, right, as a medium, as a field of study, as a method of doing ethnographic research, arouses anxiety in many people because it kind of feels inauthentic, right? That it feels as though you're not really doing the work that an anthropologist is meant to do, right? You can sit anywhere, participate in Facebook or WhatsApp chats, and people do, right, as ethnographers of the digital. So if it doesn't involve being there and working hard to be part of an unfamiliar or familiar setting in a new way, smelling the smells and tasting the tastes, is it really ethnography, right? Does that really work? And you will see in a minute the next slide, which will, which kind of, captures this conundrum. So here again, this was done a while back. It was in 2018 when even today, digital ethnography is kind of a new thing that people are still getting used to and wrapping their heads around. but you can see the kind of anxieties that it causes, right, in this meme or whatever image, right? If you look at the kind of jokes that are being made here. This is taken from another blog, right? And that's one of the ways in which the digital has really entered anthropology in a big way. We have these blogs, which are very popular as sites of, disseminating work. This is from Anthrodendum, used to be called Savage Minds, this blog, right? And so it kind of gives you this kind of jokey, comic, dark humor about being a digital ethnographer, right? How do you explain this to people that it's real ethnography, right? Um, so let me now go on to the next slide and distinguish, you know, to start with this section, analytically kind of keep digital anthropology and digital ethnography slightly separate, right? Now, as you can see, the two book covers that are part of this slide, there's no real, there's no hard and fast distinction. Obviously, one is part of the other. The same people have written about both, right? About the method of digital ethnography and generally the field of digital anthropology, but it is, useful for a moment to keep them analytically separate, right? And I'll tell you why that is, right? So if you look at examples of anthropological work that looks at the digital domain, right? That would be something like the study of digital worlds, right? So, for example, there are these virtual worlds, right, where people take up different kind of activities, become different people. I don't know if I mean I this is time for confession. I don't actually participate in the digital world as much as some people, but I have friends who do. And on Facebook, there used to be this kind of game, right? Farmville. I don't know if it still exists, but people would have these virtual fields and grow like vegetables and stuff in them and trade, and it was a big thing. And everyone around me was always playing Farmville. So the study of that kind of activity, right? What does it involve? What is the pleasure of it, right? How does that world work? How do these people who may have very different real world personae take on these different kinds of activities and lives in the virtual world, right? That would be you kind of anthropological study of a digital world, right? This is, a kind of example that I'm just giving you off the top of my head, but the more famous, better known example is there's this anthropologist called Tom Bellstorff, who's quoted by Pia in the blog entry as well. And he studied a world called Second Life, right? And he has this book on this virtual world, right? Where people literally become, take on different personae, buy property, right? Live their whole lives in this world. And that's why it's called Second Life, right? Another example of digital anthropology is the kind of study that an anthropologist called Gabriella Coleman has done of the activist hackers group called Anonymous, right? This was published, I think, in 2014, and it's called Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous, right? It's a kind of nice, catchy title, right? And there's a final, an example that I'm going to talk about more in a minute. That will be my first real example of talking about studies of the migrant experience in digital anthropology is, studies of technology, right? That say cell phone use among migrant populations or communities from which migrants, where migration is a kind of fact of life, right? And how new technology changes the dynamics of home and family, friendship, romance, etc. Right? And this is based in the Caribbean. We'll talk more about it, right? So that is broadly the field of digital anthropology. right? With digital ethnography, right, we speak of a mode of engagement, right? As the slide says, using tools and spaces provided by digital media, right? It's a way of carrying out ethnographic research, which may supplement our traditional methods, add to them or maybe change them entirely. So we can speak again the M word, right? The digitally mediated ethnography. Now, in one way, all ethnographic research has been digitally mediated in one way or another for at least the last 10 to 15 years, right? That we use recorders, we use transcription software, we use phone cameras, phones that actually do all of these things, right? Record and take pictures or whatever. We chat on WhatsApp with people that we work with, follow them on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, right? Just to keep track of what's going on with them. And they have a very, active presence in the digital domain, which is more and more of interest to ethnographers, right? And there are other ways, right, of like I said, right, the way that the digital has made its presence felt in the new in our discipline, right? For example, through blogs, right? But I'll return again to this point. You'll see it through the examples that there is no hard and fast kind of boundary between what one might call the virtual or the digital world and the real world, right? That much of these examples or much of this work that one calls digital ethnography is actually based on and dependent on prior ethnographic work which has been done face to face, right? So while the virtual adds a different dimension, you have to think in different ways about it. In There are ways in which face to face ethnography works, which is very different from the mediation of the digital. The two often go together, right? One is not complete without the other, as we'll see. I'll point out to you, right? Okay, so let me now get to my examples to explore the ways in which digital ethnography has been used to study migration and the kind of relationships that are involved in that phenomenon, right? So I'm going to, like I said, briefly talk about three examples, give you examples of studies, each with a very different focus. And the last of them will be the blog that I assigned from Allegra, right? I've also taken care to pick examples which you can look up and you can find at least some information and reading on online by yourself, right? Each of these readings also have useful lists of references, if you're interested to explore the method and the questions in more detail. So to get to the first example, this is what I think of as a kind of prehistory of the digital, right? This is the anthropologist Heather Horst and her collaborator Daniel Miller, their study of cell phone usage, as I said, in the Caribbean, right? I've just mentioned that to you. So they carried out a study of how cell phone usage had impacted a community of rural Jamaicans, specifically their interactions and expectations of relatives, friends, lovers, or partners living abroad, right? So this is the study of a technology, which, the early phase of the mobile phone, right? So this is both analog and digital at this point. These are not smartphones, right? This is not internet enabled communication, right? The study was carried out in the early 2000s, right? And the cell phone had entered the Caribbean in a big way, right? In that slide, in the image there, you see the Irish company Digicel, which set up towers everywhere all across Jamaica, became very, very popular. Every corner kind of had a store and people were getting these connections, right? All over Jamaica and Trinidad. So they carried out this small survey, right? And I think it was about 50 households that they kind of detailed, there were interviews. They looked into their contacts lists and talked to them about how they use the cell phone and how it has changed their lives, right? And like I said, I've chosen this piece to talk about because it gives us a peek into what one might call a prehistory of the transformations of that digital technology brings about in communities that depend on support from migrants abroad, right? And within whose lives the migrant experience is closely woven into social relations, right? It's part of the fabric of life, right? So what do they find in this short study, right? As you can see, there are benefits. You would expect those, right? Gone are the days of the phone box or begging and kind of being obliged to richer relatives or friends to use their phone, running to and fro from one house to another, right? To just to receive the call that somebody has, and being conscious about how much time you're taking, and not being able to talk about intimate stuff because everyone around you is listening, etc., right? So this is the new technology of the cell phone: recharge with small amounts, send messages quickly, right? So in this article they talk about how medical emergencies, for example, right, people in Jamaica having no money to pay for hospital expenses, they were quickly able to arrange money from relatives living abroad, and then that helped resolve an old relative's medical problems, right? Wives and husbands could talk to each other more frequently on their own time, right? There wasn't, you didn't have to fix an appointment and, make sure you were there or whatever. Um, so that helped sustaining long distance relationships. Individual family members could contact each other more easily, right? So there's this story in the article where there's this one member of this family who's kind of a good for nothing, right? He's not very productive, he doesn't do enough work, so the elders of the family don't actually give him much money, which comes from abroad, right? Now with a cell phone, he's able to write to message or get in touch with more sympathetic cousins or whatever who live in the US and say, I need this money for whatever. And they send him individually small amounts of money, right? So that changes the power dynamic within the family, right? So this person feels more, kind of recognized, and his relatives abroad, are able to sympathize with him or support him on an individual level without going through the elders, under whose control all the resources are, right? But of course, there are disadvantages, right? And there are these stories about how people, women who would have partners abroad would now call them and or message them and demand to know where they were, what they were doing, who they were with, right? So there's this kind of surveillance, right, which was easier to maintain now with cell phones. And of course, recharges were expensive, so people were more dependent on their relatives abroad. In one sense, they would have to ask them for money to recharge, or somehow manage the money to keep up this contact. But the most interesting observation from this study, right, at least according to me, was about the impact on the migrants themselves, right? And that's the quote that you see on the top right-hand corner of this slide, right? So we know that the distance between one's family and friends, and the country that one emigrates to, right? And in this case, as I said, it's from the Caribbean to the US, but also to UK and to Germany, right? That distance becomes important for migrants to fashion a certain kind of life and a kind of selfhood, a new place in the world for themselves, right? So they are providers for their families, right? They have respect in their communities, and they work quite hard to sustain that status, right? Even if they can't really afford it. And there are, different new kinds of freedoms sometimes that may come with a new place, a wholly different kind of life. But with the more kind of sustained contact that a cell phone, right, initiates, right, this distance kind of shrinks, right? And like we said, that's an advantage in many cases, but it's also, it kind of shrinks the space that is afforded to the migrant to reimagine their place in these worlds, right, and in the lives of their community. So the article, for example, they say that some of them report that they wouldn't pick up calls, right, when they could identify by caller ID, right, that their relatives back home were calling. And they just weren't, they knew that there was going to be a demand for money or a request that they couldn't possibly kind of oblige right then. So they would just like not, be in contact because they didn't want to embarrass themselves or their families or, shame them by admitting to their circumstances. Um, Whereas again, on the other side, though, in Jamaica, they interviewed people where they said that they now had a more realistic view of what a migrant's life was like, right? So this is a man who says every time I call my friend, he's always talking about how hard his life is, how difficult it is. He has no money. So now I stopped asking him, right? Like he's like, if his life is so hard, why even leave Jamaica, right? I'm fine right here. So the romance of the US or Europe, right, kind of they find in this study fades a little bit in the home population, right? So this is an example of how technology mediates relationships between immigrant and home communities, right? And this study, like I said before, would broadly fall in the realm of digital anthropology since it tracks the effects of the mediation of technology itself, right? Um, and this is a point I made earlier, and I'm going to emphasize it here. It depended on long-term fieldwork carried out earlier in the same place, right? So the anthropologist who did this work, right, Heather Horst, she had already done, she had a book earlier which was based on the migrant economy of Jamaica, right? So she knew these people, they knew her, they kind of trusted her with the information, with these surveys, right? She wasn't a stranger to them. So this kind of study of technology depended on face-to-face kind of fieldwork that had already happened, and then there's a little bit that happened this time as well, although a lot of it was done over the phone and through long distance contact as well. Okay, so let me now turn to my next example, right, which is a very different kind of work, right? And but the similarity is the time around which this was carried out was roughly the same. It was late 90s, 99, 2000, just slightly earlier than the Jamaica work, right? Now, this is a study of what is known as mail order marriage. Some of you may know what this means, right? This is a study by an anthropologist called Nicole Constable, right? And mail order marriage is, basically people who correspond with each other, and then the usually women from the global south, from the third world, will move to a first world country or the global north. Usually, these are they're mixed racial marriages, but usually it's women who are from the global south will migrate and marry um, the person that they've been corresponding with, who will usually be a white person in America or in Europe, right? And this phenomenon is, there are agencies, there are dating sites, there are marriage sites that kind of mediate these interactions, right? So this mail order and marriage. I don't know if you will remember that during Donald Trump's presidency, there was a whole joke, which was going on about his wife Melania, right, being a mail order bride or whatever, because she was East European, and so there's a kind of widespread stereotype of ex-Soviet countries, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asian countries like Philippines, China, etc., being, into this kind of, those are the places where women come from to marry white men in the US especially, but also in Europe. So this book is called Romance on a Global Stage, right? As my slide will say, right? So this is interesting for several reasons, right? One is the subject itself, which are, mail order brides. In this book, uh, she's worked with women of Chinese and Filipino origin, meeting with white American men online and having these virtual relationships and then ending up marrying them or not in some cases, right? And emigrating to the US. Two, the second reason why it's interesting is because the fieldwork for this study was mostly carried out online, right? As the slide mentions, we'll get to that in a second. And three, this research was carried out over a period of time and in different places. So it wasn't only on the internet, or not on the internet only in the US where the anthropologist was based, but also in China and the Philippines, right? So you have here also the national and urban cultures mediating the digital world, right? So the internet is not the same everywhere, right? The infrastructure is different, the way people use it is different, cultures of using the digital world are. So there's a way in which in this book that comes out, right? The different ways in which people navigate the digital world, right? So the book, I mean, it explores how these virtual relationships evolve. And she's mainly focused on exploding the myth that these relationships are basically exploitative, right? That they're a way for poor and aspiring women from the global south to get rich and vulnerable, whatever, husbands, right? And a new life in the global north, right, in Europe or America. And on the other hand, it's a way for lonely white men to buy essentially wives, right, with minimum effort and maximum benefit, because these are women who are not as assertive or as, you know, as strong in kind of staking their claim on the marriage or other rights that they might have as American women or European women would be, right? And many of the men in this book do say that, they are wary of American women. They are too kind of um, too too feminist. They say this, right? Some of them, and they're just they're not invested in family and love and relationships, and they find that East Asian women are, have these values which help them build marriages and relationships with them, right, in a way that they wouldn't be able to do. So Constable, who's the anthropologist, she goes into these different explanations. She explores at length how both, on both sides, there are these different kinds of expectations. And there's a wide range of women, some of whom are young and never married, others are divorced with children. And, they get into these relationships and how they manage, right? So what she basically argues is that very few women actually, get married to their pen pals only in order to move to the US, right? So the what she finds actually is that they visit back and forth, they try out relationships, see what they're comfortable with, and then decide to emigrate or not, right? Or they might go for a wholly different relationships. So one of the questions that is explored in this book is how the texture of digital ethnography is different from face-to-face interactions, right? Let me give you an example. So the reading of body language or facial expressions, the way that people move and behave while they're talking to you, how they occupy space, right, while you're meeting with them or working with them. All this is a very crucial part of ethnographic work, that's face to face, right? Now, this dimension is almost entirely missing in digital ethnography, right? Now, you can use emojis, of course, people do in chats, right? And if you pause, maybe some people will use those three dots, right, ellipses. But it's also likely that there will be first of all, not everyone does this. And then there is also not a continuous conversation, right? Like I do this all the time. Someone will message me and I'll only see it 2 hours later and reply, right? So that immediacy of the conversation is lost, right? That's why we call them asynchronous interviews, as you know, right? Interactions that happen over chat, right? And she talks about how this makes a difference in trying to gauge what people expect from you, or what you are kind of, how you are positioned in their world, right? As an ethnographer, but also between them, right? These distances, they're always trying to read each other in the absence of face-to-face contact, right? Now, another issue that she faces as a researcher is the problem of gaining trust over the internet, right? Now, the people that she's working with, especially the men, they are very wary of researchers and journalists because, they've been portrayed in these terrible, negative light all the time. They are predators or losers who can't find a girlfriend or whatever, right? Who depend on mail order brides or whatever. So they are very, leery of her, right? And she has to work very hard, and sometimes she fails to gain their trust, right? So to look at the quote on this slide, right? It helps, it shows you how being part of an online community of American men, that's the first quote on the left, right? So the anthropologist is part of this online community. It's kind of an internet list or whatever, email list of American men who were married or were in the process of marrying Chinese and Filipina women, right? And being part of these lists helped her track a change in the interactions online, right? As a white American researcher, she is most friendly with the men who actually run these lists. But as more and more wives and partners arrive, the pattern of the interaction also changes, right? So they become involved in advising people about their prospective brides, about managing problems, etc. Right? Another point to notice is something that I already mentioned, right? The digital world doesn't float free from the cultural and national context, right? It's anchored in different cultures of use and in different cultures, in different locations, right? So other anthropologists will also make this point often, right? People who work in digital ethnography, right? They'll say it's not useful to think of digital access as a zero-sum game, right? It's all or nothing, right? Either people have access or they don't, and it's the same for everyone. People have different degrees and methods of accessing this technology, of using it, right? So there is, for example, widespread use of internet cafes at this time in the Philippines, but there are very low speeds in many places. So that enables a different kind of interaction. In China, on the other hand, she finds that women prefer using personal email accounts, personal connections of the internet or with trusted friends or whatever, rather than use public places like internet cafes, right? There are people who are comfortable with email, other people who do texting, right? As we saw with the first example from Jamaica, right? Everything depends on your resources and how the digital comes to be embedded in the lives of people in a particular place, right? So a Filipina woman who is silently maybe lurking on a list in one place may become an active participant, right, on it when she's in the US and legally married, or the other way, right? It could happen that you're more confident using the internet and using your voice in a place where you're more comfortable, right, rather than in a new place. So the ethnographic eye kind of allows us to see these kind of comparative processes as well, right? To see the cultural context of technology, if we can think of it like that, right? And again, I want to make the point, this ethnography is also supplemented by face-to-face interviews and conversations. She actually goes to these places and she makes friends with some of these women she meets online, etc. Right? And she's also someone who has had experience working in Hong Kong. Um, and among, with Filipina maids who are brought over to Hong Kong to work for rich Chinese families, right? So she already has a kind of network that feeds into this work as well, right? Okay, now finally, I'll finish quickly. This is the last example here. We'll talk about the video game, right? I hope, like I said, I hope you've read what was assigned for this class and have had a chance to look at the game. Now, this is a very different perspective on digital ethnography, right? It's bringing to bear a specialized digital form, which is the video game, to the conveying and teaching of the migrant experience, right? Now, again, you will have noticed that the main work has already happened, right? The anthropologist has done face-to-face ethnographic research in this community. The life of Peng is based on people that he has interviewed and that he has lived with, right? And has written about, right? So the making of this video game represents a new dimension of older work, right? And it's also a new dimension in the relationship with the people that he's worked with, right? That he's going to represent their lives now in this new medium for a new kind of audience, maybe, right? Now, just to refresh your memories, and for those of you who didn't have a chance to read, to go over this, right? In this game, Peng is what one would call an internal migrant, right? He's going to this city to find work and leaving his family and his village behind. Um, the game basically dramatizes this journey, this day in his life, right? And is meant to put you, as the slide says, to put you in the shoes of the migrant, right? Now, there are different ways in which it does this. It invites you, like you can see on the slide, to look at the visual settings, right? The photographs in the homes, the calendars, the small shrines, the design of the shops, the streets, homes, right? So for someone who's not at all familiar or who only slightly familiar with a small Chinese village at this time, you have all these questions that you can ask, right? That, oh, okay, what is that? Why is that there, right? Or what is it? What does it mean? Does it mean anything at all? Is it just, right, those kind of questions? The game also, invites you to ask about the texture of family relationships, right? How people treat Peng, how he behaves towards them, what are the obligations that he has towards different people, right? And finally, there is, the crucial part of the game, which is that it gives you choices at every step. You get to decide what Peng's next action is going to be. Who is he going to speak to? Where is he going to go? Who is he going to ignore, right? What is he what is he going to do? And each alternative will take you to a certain place, right? In the game, right? So it's not, I was having this conversation just before this session. It's not really about winning or losing, right? It's about really the process, right? And what it tells you about the experience of the migrant, right? Going for the first time to the city, right? Debating with fellow participants about what to do and why, asking questions about Chinese culture, whatever you assume about it, right? And also thinking about the migrant experience not as a kind of, and he talks about this in his writing, right? That if you read articles about migration, they give you a set of figures. They'll say, oh, okay, people go because of these factors, etc. When you're in the shoes of Peng, right, you see how the uncertainties, the questions that you might have, the assumptions that you've made that may be wrong, right, the going forth, back and forth, right, the process, the complexity of the process, that is what the game kind of accomplishes for you, right? So the question here, and this kind of goes back to where I started. We've already spent some time talking about the ethics of ethnographic research, right? Whether it's Malinowski or Nicole Constable's work, people have all these questions, right? In this case, you could ask, is it ethical to present someone's life and their struggle, right, in this way through what he calls a computational artifact, right, a game for people to play, right? Is digital ethnography, right, removed as it is from the actual lives of people like Peng, really a helpful way of doing an anthropological study of the migrant experience, right? And here is his response. It's part of his response, right? There's a longer, which you should read, right? Is that it's a kind of, he's pointing out that anthropology is not really about uplifting or development or the adventure and romance of living somewhere else with strangers or whatever, right? It's about really trying to convey an experience that is different, right? It's a conveying a form of life, if you like, to people who may or may not know what it's like, right? Um, and so that's why he says, when we teach anthropology, right, or when we teach ethnography, that should be something that we should be teaching, and we don't do enough of that, right? And something like this video game actually helps you to, first of all, to say this is not natural, it's not unmediated, right? There's a lot of work that the ethnographer does and interprets for you, right? So there are all these alternative stories that could have happened, but you have told the story in a particular way, right? That the narrative could have many endings, right? And so ethnographic work is constructed, right? And so that's why he finds the video game useful, right? That it gives students a sense, or anyone who plays it, right? A sense of how many different ways this could have gone and how ethnographies are constructed out of lives, right? That it's not one story, there are many, many stories to be told there, right? And of course, as he says, Peng, the person whose life this game is based, he's very excited about this game. He enjoys it, and he thinks there should be, a better, more interesting game made out of it, right? So, just these are some concluding thoughts that I'm happy to hear more from you about, right? So one point I've made throughout this talk is that digital ethnography is not usually stand alone, right? It can be, as I said, there are people who've studied virtual worlds in which they may never meet the actual people who are part of Second Life or whatever. It may entirely be on the internet, but most of the time, digital ethnography depends on or is closely tied to face-to-face modes of doing ethnography. Right? The questions are kind of also similar, right? That there's a question of representation. Who controls the technology, the flow of information, images, or stories, right? This is something that Pia really worries about also, right? He's made this video game. How does it travel, right? How will he put together these stories and tell the story of someone else's life, right? That's a question that one has to think about, right? The distinction between the virtual and the real, right? Again, throughout the talk, I've kind of emphasized that it's not always, they are codependent, right? But it's not always clear. You have to explore, right, where the boundaries are and how they connect with each other. With the digital, there is also the ethics of recording and archiving, because as we know, the internet remembers, right? These can be indestructible records, right? And how to preserve anonymity, how to, protect the people that you work with, especially if they are vulnerable kind of migrant or refugee populations, right? That's something that will come up for the digital ethnographer. And finally, the fifth point here, the thought I had goes back to the first lecture. I don't know how many of you remember it, and I could attend that one of this workshop, this course, where we were talking about how more work needs to be done on migration studies from the global south, and it's worth thinking whether this could be digital ethnography is one of the ways in which we could think about studies of migration in the global south, right? as these examples have kind of shown us, right? And more with the pandemic and everything, right? More and more people will be thinking about using long distance virtual methods of doing ethnography, and they'll have to manage, the face-to-face mode with virtual work. But could it be that we have a new way of exploring migration in the global south? Okay. Now, this is my last slide, just to give you the references to the work that I've used for this presentation. Of course, one reference is also in the image. This is a very useful collection if you're interested in looking it up. The last entry here, which is from the Stanford University doing ethnography remotely, was pointed out to me by my friend Shamata Bishash at CRG. This is a very useful set of conversations that they have curated with digital anthropologists or anthropologists who are using digital ethnography during the pandemic and in other kind of crisis situations. And they talk about, these are short half-hour to 40 minutes interviews. If you're interested, you should look it up. It's a very interesting series of conversations that Stanford has put together. So that will be the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and let's get to the questions.
Thank you. This is a very interesting talk. When we start this online course on reading refugees and reading migration, we actually thought of sort of these kind of talks which sort of discusses different modes of understanding or studying migration or refugee as a subject. So I have to again stress that this is a course organized by Calcutta Research Group in collaboration with Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna, and Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. They actually supported this very interesting course. So I'm opening the floor for discussion. So Rafiqullah, please go ahead then.
Good evening, ma'am. It was indeed a very interesting lecture, and I was thinking it could have gone, for more time. It was just, I just felt that we could listen to you more and more. So thank you for that. My question, I really, what really intrigued me was there were many ideas in your lecture, but the most important that I felt, like for example, you talked about mail order marriages, but what I feel is, as a researcher, there are certain limitations. Of course, there will be certain limitations in every method that we choose to study. But for example, you were giving example of mail order marriages, and over phone they talk, and there is a mediator, and they get married. But the problem is, like, ma'am, like what happens like after marriage? Like for example, women, what kind of problems they are facing, like harassment, or they're getting beaten up by their husband. Uh, how to research, how to get to those very intimate issues about a relationship, which is not possible through digital ethnography. Like, for example, the wife may not feel comfortable to share all this over a phone. She may not even feel comfortable to share the pictures. Maybe the husband may be around, maybe the kids may be there, or there are so many issues. And like yesterday, we had interaction with Professor Paula Banerjee, and Professor Banerjee was saying about trust, which is very important in migration studies. In any ethnographic studies, trust is very important. How do one build, like we cannot be academic researchers over phone or over WhatsApp or chat or Facebook. We may not get the real things. Like we all know about fake news, fake I mean, there's so many things happening fake in Facebook, in WhatsApp, and many in social media, especially. So there are two issues. Like one is about trust, and one is about how do one study the intimate relationship. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. That's really kind of gets to the heart of, like I said, the um, problems or the hesitancies that people have, hesitations, sorry, about digital ethnography, right? Now, I would say two things in response to your question, right? Based on what Nicole Constable herself has written in her book, right? Um, One is, yes, there are trust issues, right? Definitely. She had them. She had to negotiate in certain ways. And of course, like I said, also, she did meet with people. She found it necessary to kind of meet up with them and talk to them in person. But there were also a lot of issues about, there were people who had problems on these internet lists with an anthropologist being there and researching their lives. And interestingly, it was the men who were conscious about the privacy, right? They were like, we can't trust this person. We don't know who she is, right? So she had to negotiate that in different ways, right? There were other people who read her earlier book, which she'd written. And based on that, they said, no, she seems like she's a legitimate researcher. We should give her a chance to do this, right? So she writes about those conflicts and those discussions as well, right? The second thing which she says in relation to what you're talking about intimacy and how to get at that dimension, right? Um, she says she was surprised by how open people could actually be on the internet, which they would, things they would not say face to face. She felt they were able to say in chat or in on an internet group or in letters, right? So if you think of the whole pen pal, you know, business, if you like, right? The model is based actually on non face to face intimacy, right? So these are people who are already writing letters and deeply emotional, intimate, really, letters, love letters, or expressing desire or whatever to people they haven't actually met, right? And so she was actually surprised to see how some of the Chinese women, for example, who are usually very reserved, she thought were very ready to give her access to these letters, were very ready to talk to her, right? As a white American woman who could give them some cultural access, right? Into how Americans think. Is it okay for an American man to ask me to do this on our first meeting? Is this how Americans behave, right? So she became what she calls a cultural broker of some sort. And so they were ready to share these intimate details with her as part of her kind of study and as her status as a white American person who could tell them about American culture, right? The thing about suffering in how to document that, the problems that they might have, etc. Um, Part of it was that there are these intimate groups, internet groups, which were intimate, right, for many of these participants. With the whole point of having the list was to share problems and, you know, um, find out what could be done, right? And so she's able to, they agree to make her part of these groups and they agree to kind of share their stories with her. After kind of interacting with her. So you're right, there's no purely digital, purely virtual gaining of trust. She did travel, there was face-to-face interaction, right? But on the other hand, she also makes the point that many people are more comfortable being personal and expressing feelings and sentiments online than they would be face to face. This is a strange kind of fact about the digital world, right? You will also have noticed it. So that's my response uh, to your question.
Okay. Then this is from Sucharita Gupta. Dr. Jha, thank you for such a wonderful, thought-provoking lecture. There are so many points to ponder upon and discuss, and maybe we can do that sometime later. I was particularly intrigued by your talk as I have been thinking ways to understand digital connectivity in my research, although can't deny how the pandemic kind of has pushed me and probably many others towards exploring the digital better. I'm curious whether you have noticed such a shift in conducting philo in wake of the pandemic. I mean, is digital ethnography gradually on the rise or getting validity vis-a-vis the classic anthropological face-to-face ethnographic research? Thank you for bringing up such a wide array of issues. And then I think she has written another.
Yes, okay, I just can tell you now. So it was basically on the point where you mentioned how technology is changing relationships between migrants and their families, friends. So I kind of witnessed this when I was in the camps, I mean refugee camps of Bangladesh. And so it was in 2019 and even before that. So that was when I first thought that this could also be a sort of mode of my research on how I was interested in the journey of a migrant in building networks, because I was particularly looking into the aspect of agency, in particularly in a space that is traditionally conceived as void, as sort of hapless, that of a refugee camp. So I was interested in how they are building their networks, and that was primarily through cell phones, through connectivity, internet, and all of that. So I was very interested when you sort of mentioned this, but then also it was very vague in my mind on how I can do this, and I do not know whether, I mean, if the pandemic hadn't come in suddenly, I do not know whether I would have been able to make the shift. I'm still trying to understand how I'm doing, I'm going to do it, but maybe this kind of pushed me towards exploring that particular aspect more. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. That sounds like really interesting work. Be interested to see what you turn up in your research.
Okay. Sudip Basu, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, a lot of thought-provoking points have been raised. One which comes to one's mind is how far one can actually take this notion of travel and mobility for granted, or whether we should be taking the category for granted. Simply because, if we take the digital world, this very experience of travel or mobility is, as we know, is a very disembodied experience. Even if we are currently traveling, we are actually immobile in many ways when we are interacting in the digital world. So therefore, what kind of a relation as a researcher or the research subject would have with, say, the category of place? Therefore, because since we take the mobility for granted, then place also comes under question. And if place also is coming under question, and these are some bit of an ontological question, but I don't want to go so deeply into those questions, but just basic level, what should be this notion of place? And therefore, if we take the question of place seriously, how do we think of the authenticity of these things called the social and the of identity and all that? And it comes very crucially here because if we think of a hybrid situation where you are interacting face to face with your subjects, and you're also face to face through the digital media, what should prevail over the other? Should the rules of engagement be different? If they are different, then should the rules of the off-field situation prevail over the digital interactions? Now, all these are very complex situations. What would your take be? And of course, given the pandemic, but then even if supposing the pandemic is taken care of, and you have this situation arising. How would you look at this?
Well, thanks for that. Your question is quite thought-provoking as well. So I think this is the reason why I chose these three different scenarios, right? And you can see that people deal with this question of place differently, right? That so the first off, the point that everyone makes is that ethnography, even the writing of it, is always mediated, right? So it's through your conveying some sense of place or the people or their lives or whatever, right? That the person who's reading it, who's at the other end of the public of ethnography, if you like, is getting that sense of place, right? And like I said in my talk, this idea that you were there is crucial to this kind of trust, right? Now, the thing is, more and more, right? In fact, there is someone in the series of Stanford talks that I mentioned, right? There is an anthropologist who works on Harlem, and he's an African American researcher. And he says, in the age of Facebook and Instagram, people are documenting their lives and their belongings to a place and to a community so much, and it's kind of become a huge thing. I'm not sure what an anthropologist can add, right? It's our job used to be to bring, knowledge about these communities to other people, but now they don't seem to, need us. They do this quite well themselves. This kind of demonstrating their culture, the places that they live in, what it means, etc. Right? And so there's a whole meditation on what would be the researcher's role in this world where the digital is so kind of ubiquitous, right? So our traditional understandings of location and space and relationships also have to we have to kind of change, right? Depending on what kind of work we're doing, right? So this sense of authenticity. Now, authenticity is performed in different ways in the online world as well, right? And so it may be actually the researcher's job to ask the kind of questions that you've raised, right? And I think that the examples that I gave, at different levels, those questions are coming up for each of these researchers, right? And they answer them differently, right? So in some ways, yes, the field is closer through the digital experience as through the video game. But on the other hand, it's also more distant, right? Because it's all virtual. You don't have to actually really travel with pen, right? And as you say, it's disembodied, right? But the question is, have the ideas of the body itself, right? Are they changing, and how do we deal with that? So I'm sorry, I don't have an actual answer to what you're saying. I can only offer, more thoughts and questions. But yeah, those are the questions that will face us more and more as we work with people who are themselves leading digitally mediated lives, right? And what that mediation means will come up for us in our work more and more.
Cool. Can I just ask?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So do you think that given that this heterogeneity of experiences has proliferated because of the digital mediations coming in, is it now required on the part of a community of researchers in this to have a new kind of rules of engagement, objectively specified rules of engagement with all the protocols required in order to enter into any kind of these relationships on the in the digital space, so that a certain kind of a community can emerge? Otherwise, it's so very dispersed and anonymous that it's then very difficult to read the field as a text as well. That's one problem, because after all, in the normal spaces, you have a rule, you have a way of writing, you have everything well placed, and the protocols are there. But here, these protocols have not emerged as of now.
I think that would be, as you know, if you've done ethnography, right? You have rules of engagement and certain ground rules, but the field has a way of blowing them all to bits, right? You have to, continuously negotiate the rules that you set down. And I think that maybe the way that the technology is evolving and the way that people are taking to the digital, it may not help for us to actually think in terms of rules of engagement. But I think what may be happening, what you're talking about, is in a certain way happening through these blogs that we were talking about, right? That more and more people are, and I think with the pandemic this will only grow, that writing online, sharing experiences of ethnography, of what kind of questions come up for different communities, how do you deal with the new questions, right? That may already be happening, and it may accelerate. I think that will eventually emerge as a kind of a field, a space where researchers can kind of talk to each other and see what the kind of things that they're facing and the questions that the field might throw at them at this point. So yeah, I think it's happening.
Susmita and Shonali, I'll be coming to you in a bit, but then she's user's iPhone.
Oh, I'm Biswajit.
Oh, hi. Please go
sorry.
ahead. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is actually in continuation with what Sudeep has asked about doing research in a digitized world. My question is this very interesting talk I could hear. My question is this, that if mediation is about hermeneutics, that means the ways that we interpret, the meaning that we bring out. In this sense, in a mediated world, the interpretations may be polysemic or multi-hermeneutically perceived. So in this context, then how does one perceive which interpretation remains closer to reality or valid or true?
This is actually a question that's not particular to the digital, right? This is in some ways a question that has haunted ethnographic work from the beginning, right? How do I know that your reading of this ritual or that life is actually what is going on, right? And different people find different ways to do this, but I think the major thing that, and the photographs are one way that, I was there, I talked to these people, they told me that this is what it means, and therefore I'm just conveying what they told me, right? And what they said must be the truth is the truth, right? And then there are all these contestations, right? That if you talk to different social classes of people, their version of that same practice may be different, between men and women it will be different, etc. Right? So that hermeneutical question has always, it's kind of at the heart of any qualitative research, I would say, that we do, right? But I think what the digital helps us to do, and I agree with Andrea Pia in this sense, is that what this video game, that he's designed shows is it kind of upfront presents to you these different alternatives, right? That any story will be constructed, right? And it may be up to you to see where one thread will take you, right? And they are all possible. That's the idea, right? So the reality or the truth of migration, right, is not a one-time monolithic thing. It is this multifarious kind of experience, right? And you cannot tell it in just one storyline, right? It will have different dimensions. So it kind of raises that question of hermeneutics, but in a different way, right? It challenges this idea in some ways that that there can be, where the truth lies is in one linear storyline, right? That the truth has many, the reality has many facets. which as an ethnographer you try to capture in writing, but a good ethnography always confuses you a bit, right? That you don't reach quick judgments when you read it. You're like, you don't think, oh, okay, now I know all about the Newer or this tribe, but it gives you a sense of the richness of that life, and the richness lies in the many facets, I would say, of the reality that it presents. I hope that kind of answers your question. That would be the way I think about it, definitely.
Okay. Shonali, please go ahead.
Hello. Very good evening to all of you. And my question is already been asked by the last two participants, but I have one question to ask, like how social media is trying to securitize the whole discourse of migration, or particularly the climate migration, one thing. And the second, how the social media is eroding the Sanskritization. Like we have certain kind of hope mechanism or a solidarity attitude, but social media is not trying to highlight those things, but they make, in order to make everything, in order to create buzz, they use certain kind of fearful vocabulary related to migrants. When they will come, they are going to threaten your culture and all that. I want you to add something to this, or your views on this. Thank you.
So let me try to address that. Yes, definitely. Social media is this very powerful kind of, and the powerful are going to use it to their ends, right? We've seen that. But as you say, we don't have the kind of studies that I talked about in this talk, right? But the question that we have to ask, and of course you're right, it is used by powerful people and powerful dominant groups to weaponize, the social media is weaponized against marginal communities, against migrants, against refugees, right? We have seen this. But the question for us is, how do we, given that it is such a huge part of people's lives, right? And you will see that, there are corners of the internet where people will, use it to showcase their own culture, right? There are cooking shows broadcast from villages, right? Or dances or songs that are put up by various communities to be shared among their own people, but also other people who can look it up on YouTube or whatever, right? You get these kind of images of different cultural events or forms, which you would totally, have not known about before. So obviously people are using social media and the internet in different ways, right? I agree that one has to also bear in mind the use that dominant groups make of it. But when we think specifically of the kind of research that we are doing, right, ethnography, right, in studying migrants and the phenomenon of migration, and how the digital might help us with that, might help us to do different things that we haven't thought of doing before, there is something, that's to be thought about there, right? So obviously, it's like any other thing. You can't live with it, you can't live without it, right? Social media. But social media is not, we have to learn how to understand it, and what it means for our research, right? While bearing in mind the power hierarchies that you're talking about. So that would be my response, that the work that I've talked about kind of uses the digital ethnography in different ways to help think about marginal groups, or about groups that one may not engage with otherwise, but it might actually be helped in different ways by digital engagement. So yeah, I mean, I would say think of it as opening up something new, and not just something that's been taken over by the dominant groups.
So how telephonic conversations are contributing in the research of related to migration? What is the contribution of telephonic research? You said, right?
Huh. Well, so it depends on what you mean by telephonic conversation, right? A WhatsApp chat is today also a form of telephonic research. Hai na? So it's being used more and more, I would say, for conducting chats and interviews, right? There is, again, I'll direct you to, the conversations on the Stanford site. You should listen to some of them. They're very interesting. So there is an anthropologist who talks about how during a hurricane or, just after a disaster, she was trying to get in touch with the people that she had worked with and get their views on how the disaster was being managed. And they would, the phone lines were very bad, so they did this over chat, right? Um, or when they called, it was through, someone else's cell phone or whatever. And she talks about how she started noticing the way that people use language more, right, over the phone, right? What the words they choose, the kind of intonation that they have, the quality of the voice, right? How it changes from question to question in a long conversation, right? And of course, it's much easier with these kind of chats and conversations to record, right? Of course, with permission, not without, right? But you, as a researcher, you don't have to do two things at the same time, right? Look at the person, read the situation, and also write and record, right? It's being done for you as you speak. So those are kind of the advantages, she felt, right, of doing this kind of of using digital ethnographic methods, right? And she also felt that, like Nicole Constable on the mail order brides work, right? That it's strange, but people tend to become more trusting and they reveal more personal information when they're not face to face with you. This happens with a lot of people. So that's an interesting, again, phenomenon. But of course, as I've emphasized throughout this talk, it is not that, you don't know these people and you start calling them, right? Or become WhatsApp friends with them and they'll tell you everything. There has to be prior engagement. They have to know you. You have to have worked with them to gain their trust. You can't just, start doing digital ethnography from the get-go.
Okay, thank you, Sonali. Susmita Majumdar, please go ahead.
So, ma'am, thank you so much, first, for your enlightening speech. So, actually, I have 2 points of query, not exactly question. In ethnographic research, sometimes it requires to know the language of the group that we are studying. And I have experienced this problem to a large extent because I was studying on Rohingya refugees. So how can we address this issue through digital ethnography? And second point is that I found almost the same, or I have almost the same experience as Shucharita has talked about, that the role of mobiles in the life of migrants, particularly as I worked on Rohingya refugees. I worked in the Jammu camps where they live, and I faced the issue of security question after I returned from there because of my repeated contact with them over phones. And lastly, I have to drop it. In this situation, how digital ethnography can be applied?
Now that's a really difficult question. See, in any situation with a with a threatened and marginal population like the Rohingya, it's going to be difficult, whether it's face to face or digital. And you have to be, like you said, extra careful because whatever the digital has a way of staying, right? Any recording, any archives you make are available for the state to take over, right? To give up information about the people that you're working with. So you would have to be very, very cautious with using digital tools here, right? I would even say, maybe don't do it because it's, it's without you have to work it out with the people that you're working with. But I would say in a security situation like this, you would have to be you would have to use encryption or whatever. There are all those tools that are available to protect your data and the people that you're working with. But I don't know, how far you can, you would have to talk to someone who knows about these tools and consult with them. So that's a more specialized kind of knowledge. It can be done if you really want to use those tools, but you would definitely need help. The other thing I would say, how to use digital ethnography. I can think of a few things with language especially, right? One is, it's difficult with the Rohingya language. I don't know what tools are available, but of course, a lot of people are now using online tools for translation. They're not perfect, right? Or they may make a lot of hilarious, very strange mistakes, right? But a lot, depending on what is available to you or whatever, people and the language that you're working with, people have used them. The second thing this is what anthropologists have always done. They have got interpreters, right? They work with one bilingual person or two bilingual people who become kind of the people that they also write about them, but they mediate the researchers' questions or, whatever interest to the people that they're working with, right? And I would say, mostly with ethnography, this is why I said time spent is crucial, right? A few weeks, months even, does not give you what one would call ethnographic information or whatever, right? That with time, people build trust. And with time, you become familiar with languages, right? You begin to learn how to figure out, right? You may not learn the language completely, but you establish a certain kind of relationship with people where, the nuances of the language and what is being said start to become slightly clearer to you, right, over time. Right? And people trust you more, they invite you more into their world, they try to explain things to you much more, rather than, if you just go in for a few weeks or months, they think, you're just there for a few days, why bother, right? So it's this thing that you have to become part of that life. A third thing I can think of is that if they themselves have social media groups, right? A lot of migrant populations will have Facebook or Instagram groups, to relay, to talk to each other in different places, to relay information, to keep something of their culture alive. I don't know if a threatened population like the Rohingya does that, but if they do, if they have official spokespersons or people who run these internet groups, that's something that you could maybe look into.
Thank you, Dr. Jha. I'm afraid this would be the last sort of question or comments. Please go ahead, Louis Albert.
This is not a question, but I'm just complimenting what she has said, that the role of social media during the pandemic time, and also some of the students from Northeast and UP, Bihar, and different places when they went for the studies, all considered migrant students, when they were not treated properly, when they were really scared, the mainstream media fails to respond adequately, but the social media has helped. So we can capitalize on this. That's I'm just complimenting what she has said. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Then Shafiq Rafiqullah, he said very good talk. Would like to hear more on it. Thank you, ma'am, and Siaj. So thank you, Dr. Jha.
Thank you for having me. It was great chatting with you all. Good luck with the rest of the workshop. I'm sure it's really helping you all to, think of new things. And so, yeah, thanks.